Hello, my name is Emma, and this is the very first video in the Creepy Froggy series, in which I will, talk about strange and peculiar things that have occurred in various places. And this very first one, I am standing in a cemetery. The cemetery is the old cemetery in the center of Uppsala, which is a town about 70 kilometers north of Stockholm, Sweden. And just like most cemeteries, there are quite a few stories that are attached to this one. And I'm gonna show you just a few of them in this video. Now, it's quite a nice and sunny day today, but if you can imagine this place after dark, you will get the setting for the first story, which is a ghost story. This cemetery dates back to, the 18th century. It was founded. And back in those days, people were very scared of entering this place after dark. Simply because they were scared of ghosts. In the 19th century, a group of students, they were out to prove that these ghosts were not actual ghosts, but people just mimicking ghosts and trying to scare other people. So this group of students, they went to the cemetery after dark on purpose. They went here in the middle of the night to catch a so-called ghost in the act. And they saw a man walking around with his head bent, holding a hymn book and reciting one of the hymns from it. And just as they were about to, grab the man, jump on him to prove that, haha, you're no ghost, the man vanished in front of their very eyes. And they could still hear his voice. He was still reciting this hymn. They could hear his voice clearly, but there was no sight of him. And it was quite understandable that these group of students, they just ran away from the cemetery, really, really scared. And I know that in modern days people have tried to find this ghost and not being successful. I don't know if you can see these tracks, but they're tracks of a rabbit. There's quite a lot of wildlife in the cemetery. It's very often frequented by deer and rabbits, and of course a lot of birds. They don't do very much damage though. They just sort of walk across the graves and leave tracks. But back in the days when the cemetery was first founded, it was founded for a hygienic reason. Before cemeteries, people were buried oftentimes inside churches and also just in a city or in villages, and it wasn't very hygienic because in the summer times especially you could smell the decomposition you can smell the decomposing bodies basically through the floors, because the people were buried underneath the church floors. And it was quite disgusting actually. So a lot of people started saying that we need to have proper burial grounds. It's not very hygienic. So that's when they started founding proper cemeteries like this one. And after a while they had to add some sort of fence. A lot of the times it was a stone wall all around the cemetery in order to keep out boar and other wildlife, because bodies were buried so shallowly, very shallow graves, that the wildlife, boars especially, who root up things very easily with their snouts, they dug up bodies basically and ate body parts, and that wasn't very hygienic either. So people started building walls, proper walls around the cemeteries to keep animals out. And this specific cemetery, the old cemetery in Uppsala, has recently had a problem with boar. I mean, this is Sweden's 4th biggest town. It's not huge in a worldly aspect, but in Sweden it's quite big. It's got 200,000 people-ish, and the cemetery has 12,000 burial plots. And last autumn it was plagued by a group of boar that uprooted plants and just made a whole mess of the cemetery. Now, I said earlier that this cemetery dates back to the 18th century, and that's when it was officially founded. But the earliest parts date to the 17th century, and this grave right here is one of a professor of antiquities from the 17th century. He was a professor at the university here in town, and he donated this bit where this burial is, this area. He donated it as a burial plot, and a colleague of him erected this huge runic stone looking gravestone basically at his grave, and underneath it is like a stone vault. You know, you're in a Swedish cemetery in the beginning of March when the gardeners are using tractors to plow away the snow. Not much gardening going on in the cemetery at winter, but there's always work to do. This is the grave of Gustaf Fröding. He was a famous Swedish poet who died in 1911. But he didn't die in Uppsala, but in Stockholm. And the burial ceremony is held in a church in Stockholm, and after that the body was transported north to Uppsala to be buried here. And the reason that Uppsala was chosen for Gustaf Fröding's eternal rest is that they believed that the poet of youth, that he was called, should be buried in the town of youth. After all, Uppsala was and still is a university town. That's the university main library you can see over there, and this town is filled with thousands of students each year. Another poet, he ended up writing a poem for Fröding's funeral, and he asked a composer to write the music for it so that the poem could be sung during the funeral. But since it was only like 2 days left until the funeral would actually take place, the composer was a bit afraid that he wouldn't be able to write the music in time. But he was actually inspired in the last minute by a very fitting source. You can see over there the spires of the Uppsala Cathedral. This composer, he was going to dinner when he heard the church bells ring out from the cathedral, and that sound became the inspiration for the song, the music that I wrote for the burial, the funeral of Gustav Fröding. Now we're coming up to a special grave now, and that is the grave of a very famous statesman. This is the back of it, and this one usually has, well, it's got flowers, fresh flowers today, and it's quite often visited. It is the family tomb of Dag Hammarskjöld. This is his ancestor. Dag Hammarskjöld is buried here. He is probably the most famous person resting in the cemetery. He was the Secretary General of the United Nations when he died in a plane crash in what is today Zambia in 1961. It's suspected that the plane was shot down. And Dag, he was quite popular. He was given a stately funeral in Uppsala. And when his coffin was transported from Stockholm to Uppsala, there were thousands of people that stood by the roadside to, well, say goodbye to him. And all the churches in the vicinity, they rang their bells. And the actual ceremony, burial ceremony, in Uppsala Cathedral, which you can hint the spires of behind the trees over there. That's the church, the cathedral towers. That was only attended by like close family members and friends, but after that there were some 15,000 people that pay their respects the coming hours after the funeral ceremony, and they were visiting the coffin inside the cathedral. And at the same time as this was taking place, there was a manifestation for peace held in Stockholm that about 100,000 people came to. And later on, I think the same year, 1961, Dag Hammarskjöld was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize posthumously. Now the next kind of grave we're going to visit is very unique for this cemetery. If you can see this one, it's a so-called nation grave, and there's a very special group of people in Uppsala that is quite visible during term time, and that's the students. Uppsala University is the oldest in Scandinavia and has some 25,000 full-time students each year, and they're quite visible in the cemetery as well, because dotted around the cemetery are these so-called nation graves. No other cemetery in Sweden has this kind of grave, so it's quite a special one. These graves are burial plots where students belonging to a certain student nation are buried. Here you can see the names of the students that are buried here. The first one in 1884 and the last one in 1992. Now, a student nation is a regional corporation of students, and Uppsala University has 13 of these nations. Each nation is named after a specific region in Sweden, and traditionally students would join the nation that represented the region they were from. And this tradition dates back to the 17th century. The nations nowadays offer students a space to meet, socialize, have a good time. You know, they have organizing social events like dinners and concerts. And these burial plots are burial plots for several people, like different people are buried here. Typically they were young students who died while conducting their university studies at Uppsala University. And if there was no way to get the body transported back to their hometown, or if it was very expensive, the student was simply buried in the nation grave. And this one belongs to Smålands nation, Smålands nation. And Småland is a province in the southern parts of Sweden. Now, the next grave we're going to visit is that of a young boy. His name was Bernard, and he was only 7 years old when he died in 1816. He had scarlet fever, and that's why he died. And being the son of a prominent member of society, Amalia, this little boy was never really forgotten. Writers included him in their texts, and two of the best-known poets of that era, they used to visit the boy's grave on a regular basis to read their poetry aloud here. And not far from his grave is where we'll find the next one. And the next grave belongs to a slightly older member of society. He was a student at Uppsala University when he died in 1813. And because he was poor when he died, his friends buried him next to the cemetery wall and had his name carved into one of the pillars in the wall. Very faint now, but that is the name of the student. His name was A.G. Ekeberg. And he's buried right next to this wall. Now, the burial behind me is, well, we're not going to talk about that one, but the one next to it. Because next to this very nice gravestone here lies the unknown Englishman. Well, what remains of him, more precisely his skull. It was buried here in 1978, but it's much older than that. In 1908 it was placed in a sarcophagus in Uppsala Cathedral, simply because it was believed that the skull belonged to a Swedish scientist and theologian, Emanuel Swedenborg. Swedenborg died in London in 1772, and later on, about 1912-1913, his remains were moved to be buried in a sarcophagus in Uppsala Cathedral instead. But the skull that was buried with the remains was not, in fact, Swedenborg's. Much later, in 1978, Swedenborg's real skull was found, and the skull of the unknown Englishman was buried here instead. The next burial plot we're going to visit is that of a woman who was a victim of the Estonia tragedy. Estonia was the name of a ferry trafficking the Baltic Sea between Estonia and Sweden, and in September 1994 it sank to the bottom of the sea, taking with it 852 passengers from various countries, most of them from Sweden. Her body was never retrieved from the sea, but her family put this gravestone up in memory of her. So this grave is actually empty, and it's not the only one of its kind in the cemetery. And just a stone's throw from that grave is this one. It belongs to a man named Per Hebbe, and he was a librarian who traveled a lot for work in his lifetime. And this gravestone is from a small island in the archipelago of the Swedish east coast. And it was on that island that Per fell from a tree and hurt himself so badly that he unfortunately passed away the next day. Do you remember the invasion of Iraq in 2003? Well, it was preceded by an inspection to find out about the weapons that Iraq had. Was Saddam Hussein in possession of weapons of mass destruction? The inspection was led by a Swedish diplomat and politician called Hans Blix. And this man behind me, his name is quite obscure, you can't really see it, but his name is Gunnar Blix, and he was Hans's father. In this grave rests a man called Fritjof Holmgren. He was a doctor who lived during the later half of the 19th century, and he was the person who discovered color blindness. And it just so happened that during the era that he discovered this condition, there was a big train crash in Sweden. That was in 1875. And the reason for that train crash was most likely that the train driver was colorblind. The next person we'll visit is this guy, Maximilien de Bethune. He was a French person who left France in 1789. And if you know your history books, that is the French Revolution. And he ended up eventually in Uppsala in Sweden. But nobody really knows what his true story was. People are still trying to find out who he really was. It may very well be that he, Maximilian, was the illegitimate son of a French nobleman, Prince Eugene de Bethune. And it's not strange then that he escaped France. Again, Swedish cemetery in the winter. Life goes on, and death goes on in the winter too. And we still have to bury our dead. So this is a way to heat the ground up, I guess, in order to dig graves. See smoke coming from that machine contraption thing. It's got cable running quite a long distance. Have you ever heard of the temples at Abu Simbel in Egypt? They were built to commemorate one of the great pharaohs, Ramesses II, and his queen Nefertari. Well, in the 1960s and the 70s, the artificial Lake Nasser was created when the Aswan High Dam was built along the Nile River. The creating of the lake meant that the temples at Abu Simbel would end up underwater. And the solution was to move the temples. So the temples were carefully cut into several pieces, moved and then put together again at the current location. And this guy, second from the bottom, Torgny Säve Söderberg, he had a leading role in the whole project. So he is resting right here, and part of the university is over there. This book I'm reading here is a great book. It's got maps and the locations of a lot of famous people buried in this graveyard. So I'm using that to locate the next burial, which is the last one in the show. We should be coming up to it very shortly. Here it is. It's quite an old tombstone, as you can see. It's got some moss or something growing on it. I don't know if you can see the writing on the tombstone. It says Anna Wikströms stiftelse, which means the foundation of Anna Wikström. It's not a very big burial plot, but there's actually several people resting in this grave. No less than 13 actually. The grave belongs to Anna Wikström's foundation, like I said, and Anna was a woman she went blind as a teenager, and her foundation was created in the 1880s in order to help other blind people. The foundation built a home for the blind and started a school for blind pupils, for example. The people buried in this plot here were all blind women, 13 of them, who died between 1932 and 1967. And the inscription on the gravestone reads in Swedish, "They shall see face to face." You can't really see it, but it's there somewhere on the tombstone. So 13 blind women buried here. So I hope that you have enjoyed this first episode of the Creepy Froggy theories that brings up stories from the past that can be intriguing, or in any case interesting to hear about. This first season is dedicated to burials of different kinds, graveyards, and this first episode here is all filmed in this burial ground right here, the old cemetery in the center of Uppsala, which is a town about an hour's drive from north of Stockholm. And if you're ever in town, this cemetery is well worth a visit, at least if you're interested in history, especially old history from the 18th, 19th and early 20th century. There are quite a few professors and other similar people attached with the university, and there's other interesting people buried here as well. For example, the man who performed the autopsy on the brain of Russian leader Lenin when he died. I couldn't find his grave this time though, because it's covered with snow, so it's probably better to come here in the summertime when you can see everything.